All right. Our last video in classification is about the five kingdoms. We did start off the year talking about the five kingdoms, so this is just a little quick recap. We've got our monarans. These are your prokaryotic organisms, bacteria. In the upper left there, we got our protists, algae and protozoans. And then at the bottom, we've got fungi, plants, and animals. I'll let you see all the different examples they gave you there. All right, five kingdoms. Take a look at each one individually. First one, Monera. It is a unicellular organism. Okay? That means it's made out of one cell, single cell, and it's prokaryotic. No, has no nucleus. Mode of nutrition is how does it get the energy, the food that it needs? All right. We say that it is an absorptive heterotroph. Right? That means that the organism takes in the food through itself. It absorbs through itself. And hetero means it can't make its own. It has to get it from somewhere. So it has to go get it, and it attaches to it and absorbs it. The only difference is cyanobacteria are actually autotrophs. They're very similar to algae plants. They can perform photosynthesis and make their own food. And an example there is bacteria. Protists, again, unicellular. They're single-celled organisms, but these guys are eukaryotic. Okay? They have a nucleus. Protists are what are known as ingestive heterotrophs. So they don't absorb it through their cell membrane, cell membrane. They actually have to eat. They ingest. Okay? Algae, again, algae are like cyanobacteria. They're autotrophs. They can perform photosynthesis. All right, some examples are algae, amoebas, parameciums. Third type, fungi. These are multicellular, more than one cell, except for the yeast. Yeast is a single-celled organism. It's also a fungus. Okay, there's always an example or an exception to things. These are eukaryotic also. That means they do have a nucleus. They are what's called an absorptive heterotroph, just like the moneras. Okay, so a fungus like a mushroom will sit on a tree and it will absorb nutrients through the roots. It doesn't make its own food like a plant does. It absorbs the energy through the root system. Molds, yeast, mushrooms. Plants. Plants are multicellular, more than one. They're eukaryotic. They have a nucleus. They are autotrophs, meaning they make their own food. They automatically make their own food, autotrophs, through the process of photosynthesis. Okay? Trees, grasses, that kind of thing. And then finally, we have our animal kingdom. Again, multicellular, multiple cells. They have a nucleus. They're eukaryotic. These are ingestive heterotrophs. Ingestive means they eat, basically, and heterotrophs means they can't make it themselves. Okay? They got to eat their food in order to get the energy from it. Okay? All right, levels of classification. Again, got a video here, right here, on classification. Highly recommend you watch that, either now or at the end. You can look over here on the right and you can see the levels of classification. Okay, so the largest classification system we have is called the kingdom. It's the largest, broadest level of classification. It has the most individuals and they are very distantly related. So like the animal kingdom, all the animals fall into the animal kingdom. But then it's a very large group, so we have to break those kingdoms down into smaller and smaller units. And this is the way we do it. Kingdoms break down into what are called phylums. And then phylums can be broken down into classes, class into order, order into family, family into genus, genus into species. These last two are going to be very important to us because this is the two-word naming system that we use to classify the organisms that are on the planet. Species The smallest level of classification has the fewest individuals, and they are very closely related. Okay? A species is a collection of individuals that are able to breed and produce viable offspring. All right, naming organisms. Organisms are named using a two-word system. We call that a binomial nomenclature. It's just a big fancy Latin term for to name. Okay, two-word naming. To name, binome, to name, two-word naming. It uses the genus and the species to name it to give a scientific name for the organism. Some examples. The scientific name for human is Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus that we belong to. Sapiens is the species that we belong to. And notice that the genus is capitalized and the species is lowercase. It's always done like that. All right. Sugar maple is Acer saccharum. Acer is the Latin word for maple. And sugar, saccharum, you've heard of saccharide maybe? Saccharum. Saccharum is the Latin word for sugar. And then we also have red maple as an example. Acer, again, the Latin word for maple. And rubrum is the Latin word for red. Right? Again, notice genus, capital letter, then species, lowercase. Phylogeny is the branch of science that deals with the evolutionary relationships between organisms, or phylogeny, however you want to pronounce it, okay? A phylogenetic, also known as a phylogenic, those two words are kind of interchangeable, so it'll make it a little confusing, but we can use them both interchangeably. A phylogenetic tree is a graphic representation of these evolutionary relationships. It looks literally like a tree, and the branches represent different organisms. Organisms that appear on closely attached branches are closely related, where organisms that are on distantly attached branches are distantly related. So it looks kind of like this. All right. Down here, the trunk is what we call the common ancestor to everybody. And then it split off at some point in the past. So all of these guys, all these bacteria are more closely related to each other than they are to either this group or this group. We've got three main groups here. We've got bacteria, we've got archaea, and we've got eukarya. Each trunk represents a common ancestor for anything that's above it. So this would be the trunk common ancestor for anything up here. This is the common ancestor for anything up here. This would be a common ancestor for anything here, and this is a common ancestor for all of it. If you go back far enough through time, we're all very distantly related. All right, so here's our common ancestor in this picture here. Oh, let me get that thing away. Give it a second to disappear. Our common ancestors at the bottom. Okay, notice we've got some groups going on. I kind of circled some common groups here. All of the birds that are on this tree, see penguin, chicken, duck, pigeon, those are all more closely related to each other than they are to the mammals, human, monkey, horse, dog, etc., etc. You see that? Because they're on different branches. All of the mammals are more closely related to birds than they are to the reptiles and the fish. Because these two guys right here, this group and this group, have a common ancestor way down here. But in order to get a common ancestor for all of them, you have to go way back to here to get a common ancestor for all of them. So the further up the tree you go, the more branching you get, the further up the tree you go, the more closely related they are. So for example, humans and monkeys have a common ancestor right here, very closely related. Humans and monkeys are more closely related to each other than they are to horse, donkey, pig, etc. Okay? So the closer the branches are to each other, the more closely related the species is. The tree can look like a tree, or it can be straight lines. It still shows the relationship between the related organisms. They don't necessarily have to draw it so it looks like a tree. It can just be a bunch of lines pointing in a certain direction. If the tree has a time scale, and an organism doesn't reach the top, the present, that means the organism went extinct and it disappears from the tree. Okay? If it still exists at the top of the tree, that means it's still around today. If the line stopped before reaching the present, that organism is no longer around. It went extinct. Here's a couple more examples of how you might draw a tree of life. Notice all the ones down here. We got a common ancestor, and then it starts to branch off and branches off and branches off more and more and more, so that the closer things are to each other on the branches, the more closely related they are to things that are further away. Here's another example. The circle there, the part where I've circled things down here, see those circles there? Those represent organisms that are now extinct. They didn't make it to the top of the tree. They died out before continuing on. Here's a little one showing hoofed animals. You can see down at the bottom, we have our common ancestor way down here, and then it branched off in multiple different things. And then, so all these guys are all more closely related to each other than they are to these guys. Here's your whales. Here's your camels and cows and things like that. Okay? Elephants and hippos and horses and stuff over here. So these are all these, as you get further up, they get more and more specialized until eventually at the very tip top, you could find individual species, individual organisms. Notice where I've circled here. See how this little branch stops right there? This branch stops right there. This branch stops right there. This branch stops. This one stops. This one stops. This one stops. If the branch stops and doesn't make it all the way to the top like these did, that organism, particular species of organism, went extinct. It's no longer in existence. And that's the end of classification.